Sexual behavior and attitudes toward those behaviors, socially, politically, and culturally, have evolved numerous times in ways that showcase the fluidity of acceptance. Historically, one can look at the Greek and Mediterranean cultures to understand the ways in which acceptance of both pedophilia and homosexuality were depicted through literature, art, poetry, mythology, and theater. Homosexuality was institutionalized. Conversely, while Greeks found same-sex relationships with minors beautiful, Romans used their propensity for sadism as both a weapon and a form of entertainment. By the Middle Ages, however, sodomy was illegal, and thus attitudes toward deviant behaviors such as sodomy, masturbation, bestiality, fellatio, anal intercourse, etc., became hostile, and they were criminalized. The determination of what age constituted a child, however, was still subjective. The Catholic Church dominated most of the discussion regarding what was criminal, and what was acceptable. Though, to be fair, the Church in general was much more involved in politics in Europe than it would ever be in the United States, at least on paper. In the 20th century, the industrialization of commerce saw vast changes to the American household, but moreover, the classifications of mental health crises, deviant behavior, and the entire medical field saw various changes and reform. Research began to revolutionize psychopathology and the way those exhibiting deviant behavior could be treated or diagnosed. However, it wasn't until the 1970s that researchers began to link sexually deviant behavior and social problems. The political and legislative changes that developed in response to both media and research framed 3 points in the 20th century wherein outcries to control sexual fiends, sexual psychopaths, and sexual predators exemplified the changes in attitude. Richard von Krafft-Ebing and his book Psychopathia Sexualis concluded that sexual deviants were mentally ill, pathological, loathsome, and a threat to social hygiene. He paid particular attention to homosexuals. While this is antiquated in the 21st century, the 12 editions of Psychopathia Sexualis influenced the research that would continue throughout the ebbs and flows of public outrage. Havelock Ellis and Sigmund Freud disagreed with Krafft-Ebing in that homosexuals could be cured, though Freud did believe that deviance is rooted in psychopathology. However, Freud famously attributed sexual deviance to character disorders and the development of the psyche through childhood. The shift in attitude toward the dangers of sexual exploitation of children influenced the public demand led by the Women's Christian Temperance Union to raise the age of consent due to their belief that exploiting young women and girls was key in their moral turpitude. A rise in child sex crime homicides from 1910 to 1915 would further outrage the American people, and the media's responsibility to report was muddied by the media's ability to incite and exploit. As the move toward positivism, which is the belief that people are social beings who want to conform but are compelled to commit offenses for reasons beyond their control, advanced, so did research into the motives of deviant criminals. From this research, remedies for deviant behavior arose in the form of eugenics, among other barbaric treatment of human beings. Sterilizations and castrations would continue to be used until 1942. Though fear of sexual fiends would subside, it wasn't long until the fear of child murderers would incite public outrage. The 1930s saw new legislation due to media coverage of serial rapist and murderer Albert Fish. Law enforcement sought to quell fears by ramping up arrests for homosexuality and other, at the time, minor sexual offenses. Thus, America developed a new fear of what would be called the queer threat, and in that fear was the unfortunate connection of homosexuals to pedophilia. As arrests increased, so did institutionalizations. Though the inhumane treatment of those in psychiatric care is now well documented and well known, at the time there simply was no well-devised plan as to how sexual deviants could be treated, and thus they were often committed and hospitalized for years, while doctors had no true understanding of deviant behavior. The media and politicians, as well as law enforcement, depicted sexual deviancy as criminal and perverse. Politicians exploited the fear of sexual predators to gain votes when they made promises to rid society of a group of people that was categorically uncategorized. Overcommitment to hospitals exacerbated the issues with defining what was deviant and what was normative. In fact, with no cure at all, the explosive number of those committed for various crimes, both major and minor, did little to help the offender and essentially focused on quelling the fears of the public. In the 1960s and 70s, the sexual liberation and changed perspectives towards sexual behavior altered perspectives on sex and deviancy and revolutionized the way that those previously thought to be deviant were treated both legally and socially. Homosexuality became acceptable and was removed entirely from the DSM in 1973. At the same time, women finally gained a voice due to feminism, and the women's movement made steps toward altering the negative view of female victims and promoting legislation protecting women from sexual violence. Negative opinions of women still exist, though the Me Too movement has exposed why that is. In cases such as Brock Turner and Brett Kavanaugh, one can see that there are multiple reasons why women's claims are dismissed. Both power and patriarchy are key components of the devaluing of the female victim. Now, back to the 1980s and the development of the stranger danger panic. Again, the media was key in the sudden fear of the sexually violent predator. Wesley Allen Dodd and Earl Schreiner, both child rapists and murderers, were known to both fantasize about reoffending upon their release from prison. Because of this, SVP legislation defined offenders who had been convicted or charged as someone who suffers from a mental abnormality or personality disorder that makes the person likely to engage in predatory acts of sexual violence. In essence, the person is predisposed to offend. Though the same problems exist in SVP legislation as they did in sexual psychopathy laws, one of the more accepted advancements of the era was the implementation of Megan's Law, which dictates that sexual offenders must be registered so that the community knows where they live and how close they are to their children. Unfortunately, this has its own problems, wherein the sexual offense is often not nearly as serious as most assume, due to case files being relatively difficult to attain for casual internet sleuths.